Stay with me until the very end of this story. Because what you are about to hear is not just a story about one family. It is a story about every family that was ever told they did not matter. It is a story about what happens when the people in power decide that certain lives are too inconvenient to remember, too dangerous to document, too ordinary to deserve a place in the official record. And it is a story about a single, cracked, water-damaged VHS tape that sat inside a cardboard box in the corner of a storage unit in rural Ohio for 31 years, slowly collecting dust, slowly deteriorating, quietly holding a secret that the state of Georgia never wanted anyone to find. My name does not matter right now. What matters is that 18 months ago, a woman named Delia Marsh drove 400 miles to clean out the belongings of an uncle she had never met, and inside a box labeled, "Junk Dio Not Keep," she found something that stopped her cold. She found a tape with no label held together with a strip of electrical tape, and when she finally found a machine old enough to play it, she sat on the floor of her kitchen and cried for 2 hours straight. Not because it was sad, though it was. Not because it was shocking, though it was that too. She cried because the people on that tape were laughing. They were eating dinner and arguing about the television, and teasing each other and loving each other in the loud, messy, beautiful way that families do. And she knew with the kind of certainty that settles into your bones, that someone had worked very hard to make sure no one ever saw this. This is the story of the Beaumont family. This is the story of what was done to them, and why and how one tape survived when everything else was taken away. Stay with me. Chapter 1. The Family That Existed. The summer of 1987 was the kind of summer that southern towns like Harlan Creek, Georgia, seemed to produce almost on purpose, slow and golden and suffocatingly hot. The air thick with the smell of pine resin and red clay, and the particular sweetness of overripe peaches falling from the trees along Route 9. It was the kind of summer that felt, to a child, like it would never end. And for 9-year-old Marcus Beaumont, that feeling was not a complaint. That feeling was the greatest gift the world had ever given him. Marcus was the youngest of 4 children born to Samuel and Ruth Beaumont, and the Beaumont house sat at the end of a dirt road that turned to mud every time it rained, which in Harlan Creek was often. It was not a large house. It was not a beautiful house, not in any way that a magazine would recognize. The porch sagged slightly on the left side, because Samuel had been meaning to fix the support beam for 3 years, and kept finding other things that needed doing first. The kitchen linoleum had a crack running diagonally from the refrigerator to the base of the back door, and Ruth had placed a braided rug over the worst of it and called it decorated. The windows in the 2 upstairs bedrooms did not quite close all the way, which meant that in the summer the heat poured in freely, and in the winter so did everything else. But the house was theirs. Samuel had worked 7 years of double shifts at the Caldwell paper mill to save the down payment, and when he and Ruth had walked through the front door for the first time with their oldest daughter, Patricia balanced on Ruth's hip, and the twins, James and Leon, running ahead through the empty rooms, Samuel had stood in the middle of that cracked linoleum kitchen and quietly wept, because in 1974 in Harlan Creek, Georgia, a black man owning his own land was not a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. By 1987, the Beaumont house had settled into itself the way homes do when they are truly lived in. The walls were covered with Ruth's embroidered samplers and school photographs, and a painted wooden cross that her mother had carried from Alabama in 1951. The bookshelves that Samuel had built himself in the garage were crammed with paperbacks and encyclopedias and Marcus's collection of almanacs, dating back to 1979, because Marcus was the kind of child who read almanacs for pleasure, who could tell you the average annual rainfall of any county in Georgia, who had already decided that he was going to be either a meteorologist or a marine biologist, and had not yet realized that these ambitions were not mutually exclusive. The kitchen table was large enough for 6, but rarely only seated 6, because Ruth believed in the specific theology that no one who came to her door around dinner time should have to leave hungry, and so there were always extra plates, always an extra pot of something on the stove, always room for one more chair to be dragged in from the porch. Ruth Beaumont was, by any measure that a reasonable person could apply, extraordinary. She was not famous. She did not run a corporation, or hold elected office, or publish books, or appear on any stage anywhere that history would bother to record. She was a woman who worked 3 days a week at the Harlan Creek Elementary School as a teacher's aide, who spent the other days keeping her household running with a precision and grace that her children would not fully appreciate until they were grown and attempting to keep their own households running and finding it very much harder than she had made it look. She was a woman who knew the name of every child on her street, who sat with sick neighbors, who organized the church rummage sale every October with such thoroughness that the other women on the committee both relied on her completely and occasionally found her slightly exhausting. She was a woman who laughed with her whole body, who cried at commercials, who had opinions about everything from foreign policy to the proper way to fold a fitted sheet, and who expressed all of these opinions freely and without apology, which was a quality that some people in Harlan Creek found admirable and others found alarming, depending on which side of her opinion they happened to land on. Samuel was quieter, but not in the way of men who have nothing to say. He was quiet in the way of men who were always thinking, always turning a problem over in their mind, looking at it from one angle and then another, waiting until they were certain before they spoke. He had grown up in Harlan Creek himself, the son of a sharecropper, and he had clawed his way to the paper mill job, not because the paper mill was his dream. His dream had been engineering. A dream that a combination of poverty and the particular cruelties of the Georgia school system in the 1950s had made technically impossible. But because the paper mill paid a union wage, and the union wage paid the mortgage, and the mortgage paid the mortgage, and the mortgage paid for the house, and the house was the foundation on which everything else was built. He understood foundations. He understood that the things you could not see were often the things that held everything else up, and he lived accordingly, quietly and methodically reinforcing the invisible structures of his family's life so that Ruth could be loud and warm and present in the ways he found harder, and so that his children could be, simply, children. Patricia was 23 that summer and had moved to Atlanta 2 years earlier to take a job at a hospital there, first as a receptionist and then, after completing night classes at Atlanta Metropolitan, as a licensed practical nurse. She came home on holidays and FA, or a few weeks each summer, and when she was home the house got louder and more chaotic in the best possible way, because Patricia had her mother's total absence of restraint about expressing whatever she was feeling, plus a wicked sense of humor that she had developed somewhere in the Atlanta hospital system, and that occasionally caused Samuel to look at her over the top of his glasses with an expression that was trying very hard to be disapproving and not quite managing it. The twins, James and Leon, were 19 and had both stayed in Harlan Creek, James working at the hardware store and taking automotive courses at the community college. Leon doing day labor and playing guitar in a band that performed at a bar outside of town on Friday nights, and that was, according to Leon, about to be discovered at any moment. Samuel had stopped asking about the day when Leon planned to get a real job and had instead started silently hoping, in the way of parents who have surrendered to the inevitable, that the band would indeed get discovered soon so that Leon's certainty would at least be vindicated. And then there was Marcus, 9 years old, gap-toothed and bespectacled, obsessed with weather patterns and ocean currents. The one who followed Ruth around the kitchen, asking questions she couldn't always answer, and then running to the encyclopedia to find the answers himself, and then coming back to tell her what he'd found, as if she had asked. That was the family. That was all of them. Ordinary, and extraordinary in the same breath, alive and noisy, and present in the world, mattering to each other and to the neighborhood around them and to the particular corner of Harlan Creek, Georgia, where their house sat with its sagging porch and its cracked linoleum and its shelves full of books. They had no idea that someone had already decided they were a problem. The man who had decided this was named Gerald Pitts, and he was the chairman of the Harlan Creek Development Authority, which was a grand title for a small organization, but in a small town, small organizations wielded large power. And Gerald Pitts had been wielding his for the better part of 15 years. He was 61 that summer, a real estate developer who had made his initial money building strip malls outside of Macon in the 1970s, and who had returned to his hometown of Harlan Creek in 1980 with a vision. The vision was called Harlan Creek Estates, and it was a planned residential community of single-family homes aimed at Atlanta commuters who wanted more space for less money and were willing to drive 45 minutes to get it. The concept was sound. The Atlanta suburbs were beginning their long sprawl southward, and there was genuine appetite for exactly what Gerald Pitts was proposing. He had investors. He had preliminary architectural drawings. He had a sales brochure with an artist's rendering of cul-de-sacs and neighborhood parks and a clubhouse with a swimming pool. What he did not have, and what he needed in order to make the numbers work, was a particular stretch of land on the eastern edge of Harlan Creek, running along Route 9, where the old peach orchards were, and where a dirt road led to several houses, including, at its end, a house owned by Samuel and Ruth Beaumont. Gerald Pitts had approached Samuel in the spring of 1986 with an offer to buy the property. Samuel had listened carefully and politely, asked several precise questions about the offer, and then declined. He had explained, with equal politeness, that the house was not for sale. Gerald Pitts had gone home and revised the offer upward and returned with it 2 weeks later. Samuel had listened again and declined again. Gerald Pitts had revised the offer a third time. Samuel had declined a third time, and D had added, on this occasion, that he understood the development project Mr. Pitts was proposing, and that he wished him success with it, but that his house was his home and his land was his family's land, and he was not interested in selling at any price, and he hoped that Mr. Pitts would understand and respect that position. Gerald Pitts had gone home and not revised the offer a fourth time. He had instead made several phone calls. The phone calls were the beginning of the erasure, though nobody called it that yet, and nobody would call it anything for another 31 years, not until Delia Marsh sat on her kitchen floor and cried. What followed in the months after those phone calls was the kind of thing that looks, in isolation, like a series of unrelated bureaucratic inconveniences, but that assembles itself, in retrospect, into something with a clear shape and a clear purpose. The county health inspector cited the Beaumont house for code violations in the fall of 1986, violations that Samuel disputed, that other houses on the same road demonstrably shared but were not cited for, and that required expensive repairs to address. Samuel made the repairs. In early 1987, the paper mill announced a restructuring that eliminated Samuel's position, along with 11 others, though Samuel's was the only one on his particular shift, and the remaining workers on his shift were, to a man, white. Samuel filed for unemployment and began looking for other work. The unemployment claim was initially denied on a technicality that Samuel's union representative described as, quote, the most creative interpretation of the eligibility rules he had ever seen in 20 years of representing workers. It was eventually approved after appeal, but the delay cost the family 2 months of income. In the same period, James lost his job at the hardware store under circumstances that James would describe as suddenly and without explanation, and the hardware store owner would describe when asked as a slow period, business reasons, nothing personal. These were the visible things, nothing personal. These were the visible things. There were also invisible things, phone calls not returned, loans not approved, small doors, quietly closed. The machinery of exclusion does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply lets you struggle and watches and waits. Through all of it, Ruth kept the table set and the stove going, and the children from knowing the full weight of what was pressing down on their family. This was both her heroism and, she would sometimes think late at night, her greatest act of self-deception, because Marcus was 9 and saw more than she gave him credit for, and the twins were old enough to read the lines of stress on their father's face, even when their father's voice remained steady. And Patricia called from Atlanta every Sunday and asked questions that were careful in the way that questions are careful when the person asking them is afraid of the answer. The tape that Delia Marsh found was recorded in July of 1987. Patricia had come home for 2 weeks, and Leon had gotten hold of a camcorder. Borrowed, he said, from a friend. Borrowed, he said, from a friend. Though James would later admit that the friend was a pawn shop and the borrowing was actually a rental, and the cost of the rental was something Leon had not mentioned to their parents, and they had spent an entire Saturday filming everything. They filmed breakfast, Ruth scrambling eggs and narrating what she was doing in the voice of a cooking show host, while Samuel sat at the kitchen table with his newspaper and pretended not to find this as funny as he clearly did. They filmed Marcus explaining at considerable length the formation of cumulus clouds, while everyone around him gradually lost interest but politely pretended not to. They filmed a water balloon, a fight in the backyard that began as a structured competition and dissolved rapidly into chaos, with everyone including Samuel getting thoroughly soaked and Patricia screaming with laughter so hard she had to sit down on the grass. They filmed dinner, all 6 of them around the table, with 2 extra chairs for a neighbor and her daughter who had stopped by and been absorbed, as people always were, into Ruth's orbit. They filmed Leon playing guitar on the porch. In the evening, while the light turned golden and the fireflies came out, and Marcus sat on the porch steps, eating a peach and swinging his bare feet in the air. At one point, Ruth took the camera from Leon and pointed it at Samuel, who was sitting in his chair on the porch reading, and she said, "Samuel, say something for the camera." And Samuel looked up from his book and looked directly at the lens and said, after a pause, "We are here. We have always been here." And Ruth laughed and said, "That's the most Samuel thing anyone has ever said." And Samuel smiled and went back to his book. They had no idea, when Leon returned the camera to the pawn shop on Monday morning, that what they had recorded was the only proof that would survive, because by the following spring, everything had changed. The county moved to condemn the Beaumont property in February of 1988, citing a combination of the previous health code violations and new concerns about soil contamination near the foundation. Concerns that arose from a report commissioned by the Development Authority and conducted by an environmental consulting firm that Gerald Pitts had used on 3 previous projects. Samuel retained a lawyer, a young woman named Carol Ames, from Macon, who took the case on a reduced fee because she looked at the documentation and felt something cold run through her. The sensation that lawyers sometimes get when they are looking at something that is not what it is pretending to be. Carol Ames filed challenges and demanded independent inspections and wrote letters that were precise and well-argued, and that the county responded to in the way that institutions respond when they have already made a decision. Slowly, inadequately, and with confidence that the other party would eventually run out of resources before they did. Samuel did not run out of resolve. He ran out of money. The legal fees, coming on top of the lost income from the mill and the repair costs and the accumulated pressure of the preceding 18 months, finally reached a threshold that the family's savings could not absorb. In October of 1988, Samuel and Ruth Beaumont signed the papers transferring their property to the county for a price that was 60% of the house's assessed value, the minimum required by the condemnation statute. And they loaded their belongings into a rented truck and moved to a rental apartment in a town 20 miles away. and the house on the dirt road off Route 9 was demolished 4 months later, and by the time Harlan Creek Estates broke ground in 1990, there was no physical evidence remaining that the Beaumont family had ever lived there. The records of the condemnation proceeding, the health code citations, the environmental report, all of it was filed in the county courthouse and accessible in theory to anyone who asked. But the county archive suffered a partial flood in 1993 that damaged a significant portion of records from the late 1980s, including, specifically, the files related to properties condemned along Route 9. The Development Authority's own records from the same period were disposed of during an office renovation in 1997, consistent, a spokesperson would later explain, with standard retention policy. Gerald Pitts died in 2004, and his personal papers were, according to his family, discarded. The lawyer who had handled the condemnation filing retired in 1999, and her records were sealed per client confidentiality. Carol Ames kept her files, but Carol Ames died of cancer in 2001, and her files went into storage with her estate, and the executor of her estate was a nephew in Florida who did not know what to keep and threw most of it away. The Beaumont family did not cease to exist, of course. Samuel and Ruth rebuilt, painfully and slowly, in the town 20 miles away. Samuel found work as a maintenance supervisor at a school district. Ruth went back to school herself at 51 and got her teaching certification and spent 12 years as a second-grade teacher and was, by every account of every parent and child she taught, extraordinary at it. Marcus grew up and did, in fact, become a meteorologist, working for a National Weather Service office in Tennessee. James opened his own auto repair shop. Leon never did get discovered, but he married and had 3 children, and taught guitar lessons on weekends and seemed, by all evidence, entirely at peace with how things had turned out. Patricia became a registered nurse, and then a nurse practitioner, and eventually the director of nursing at a hospital in Atlanta. They rebuilt their lives. They were not defeated, but they were erased from the place that had shaped them. Stripped of the home that Samuel had wept with joy to own, written out of the official story of Harlan Creek's transformation into a prosperous suburb where people with money moved to raise their families, not knowing, or not asking, whose land they were raising their families on. Samuel died in 2009. Ruth died in 2014. They never went back to Harlan Creek. Marcus, by the time he was in his 40s, had spent years trying to piece together the documentary record of what had happened to his family, and he had found very little because, very little remained. He had the legal documents that Carol Ames had sent to his parents during the proceedings. Samuel had kept them in a folder, labeled simply House, and Marcus had found the folder when he was going through his father's belongings. He had a few photographs. He had his own memories, the memories of a 9-year-old, which are vivid in some places and full of gaps in others, the way all childhood memories are. He had the story his parents had told him and his siblings over the years, in fragments, reluctantly, because Ruth in particular did not like to talk about that time, and when Marcus asked her about it, she would say, "We kept going. That's what matters," and change the subject. He did not have the tape because he did not know the tape existed. He would not know for another 20 years. Chaffed. 2. What the tape remembered Delia Marsh was not by temperament, a person who believed in signs. She was a high school chemistry teacher in Columbus, Ohio, which is a profession that tends to organize the world into things that are empirically demonstrable and things that are not, and she applied this framework broadly to her classroom and to her life and to the somewhat complicated emotional landscape of being the only person in her family who had volunteered to clean out the storage unit of her late Uncle Robert, who had died in March at 74. who had been estranged from the family for reasons nobody agreed on, and who had apparently spent the last 3 decades of his life accumulating an impressive quantity of things that were, not to put too fine a point on it, mostly junk. Robert had not been a blood uncle. He had been the husband of Delia's great-aunt Cora, who had died in 2010, and the estrangement had something to do with money after Cora's death, and the specifics had become, over the years, one of those family stories that everyone knows a different version of, and nobody wants to be the one to actually look into. Robert had left everything to a great niece he had apparently been fond of, and who lived in California, and who had emailed DLA, somewhat apologetically, to ask if she might be willing to handle the Ohio end of things, given that she was the closest geographically, and given that the California great-niece had 2 young children and a full-time job, and the storage unit fees were already 3 months overdue. Delia had driven to the storage facility on a Thursday in June, armed with a rented cargo van and a thermos of coffee and the grim resignation of someone who has agreed to do something they did not particularly want to do, but felt was the right thing. The unit was 10 by 20 feet and filled, floor to ceiling, with the accumulated residue of 2 long lives. Cora's things and Robert's things, all mixed together in the way of couples who have shared a space so long that their possessions lose track of who they originally belonged to. There were boxes of dishes and boxes of books and boxes of clothing that should have been donated 30 years ago, and a truly inexplicable number of lamps and 2 complete sets of encyclopedias from different decades and a sewing machine and several pieces of exercise equipment that gave every impression of never having been used, and a box labeled junk, do not keep in Robert's handwriting, sitting on the floor in the back right corner, under a rolled-up carpet. Delia was systematically working through the unit, sorting into piles of donate, discard, and ship to California when she reached the junk box. She opened it, expecting junk. What she found was the accumulated odds and ends of a life's miscellaneous drawer, dead batteries, a broken watch, tangled extension cords, several keys that fit no lock she would ever identify, a 1994 Cal Endar from an insurance company, and at the bottom a VHS tape wrapped in a plastic grocery bag and secured with a strip of electrical tape and unlabeled. She held it in her hands for a moment. Her first instinct was to put it in the discard pile. Her second instinct, which arrived about 30 seconds after the first, was curiosity. She did not own a VHS player. Nobody she knew in Columbus owned a VHS player. But the tape was clearly old and clearly had been wrapped with some care, as if someone had wanted to protect it, and for a reason she could not have articulated in the empirically demonstrable terms she preferred. She put it in the ship to California pile instead of the discard pile, and then she thought better of it and put it in her own bag, because something about throwing it away without knowing what was on it felt wrong in a way she was not prepared to examine too closely. She found a VHS player 3 weeks later at a thrift store, a JVC that still worked, and she connected it to her television with the patience of someone solving a mildly irritating puzzle, and she pressed play. For the first 40 seconds there was static, and then the image resolved, and she saw a kitchen she didn't recognize, and a woman who was laughing and making eggs, and a woman who was laughing and making eggs, and a man sitting at a table with a newspaper, and she had absolutely no idea who any of these people were. She watched for 20 minutes, leaning forward slightly, the chemistry teacher's part of her brain, quietly cataloging details, while another part of her, a part she didn't have a precise name for, simply felt the weight of what she was watching. The ease of these people with each other, the specific vocabulary of this family, the shorthand, the running jokes she could sense the shape of without understanding the content, the way the mother touched each of her children briefly as she passed them, a hand on, a shoulder, a squeeze of an arm, almost unconscious, a reflex of love. The father's face when he wasn't aware of being filmed, relaxed and gentle in a way that the formal moments in front of the camera didn't quite capture. The little boy with the glasses explaining clouds to a camera that was slowly, affectionately being tilted away from him. When it got to the moment on the porch where the woman pointed the camera at the man reading his book and asked him to say something, and he looked up and said, quietly, "We are here. We have always been here," Delia Marsh did not immediately cry. She sat with it for a moment, and then she cried. She didn't know why. She didn't know who these people were, or what had happened to them, or why a tape of their ordinary Saturday was sitting at the bottom of a box labeled junk in a storage unit in Ohio. But she knew, and this was the part she could not explain empirically, the part that lived outside the framework she usually applied to the world. She knew that it mattered. She knew that something had happened here, something that this tape was the last evidence of, and that finding it was not neutral. She spent the next 3 weeks trying to figure out who the family on the tape was. She looked through everything that had come from the storage unit, looking for any connection. She found nothing in Robert and Cora's things that directly pointed to the family on the tape. She called the California great-niece, who had no idea. She looked at the tape more carefully and noticed, on the plastic casing, a very faint series of letters and numbers in pencil, almost completely worn away. BCM 787, which told her, if she was reading it right, that it had been made in July of 1987. She noticed that one of the women on the tape, the older one, who was clearly someone's mother, was wearing a shirt with what looked like a school name on it, The image quality was not good enough to read the text. She took the tape to a video restoration shop. This was the decision that changed everything. The restorer was a man named Paul Goetz, who operated out of a small shop near the university, and who had spent 30 years rescuing deteriorating footage, and who told Delia when she brought the tape in that it was in surprisingly decent condition given its age, that the plastic bag had helped, that he could significantly improve the image and audio quality. When he handed her the restored digital file 2 weeks later, she sat in her car in his parking lot and opened it on her laptop. And the first thing she noticed was that in the background of the kitchen scene, on the wall, there was an embroidered sampler that she could now read clearly. It said in Ruth's neat stitchwork, B.E.R. Omont, Home Sin Seas, 1974. And below the restored footage, Paul had written a note. During cleanup, I could read the label on the father's mill ID badge. Caldwell Paper Mill, Harlan Creek, Georgia. Thought it might help. Delia went home and searched for Beaumont, Harlan Creek, Georgia, and found almost nothing, which was, in itself, information. She found Marcus through a combination of a public records search and the kind of persistence that, had she applied it to her students, would have been considered unreasonable. She found a Marcus Beaumont, meteorologist, Tennessee. She found an email address. She wrote him a message that she drafted 7 times before sending, because she did not know how to say what she needed to say in a way that would not sound either insane or callous. And what she settled on, finally, was very simple. She said that she believed she had found something that belonged to his family, and that she wanted to ask if he was the right person, and that she was sorry if she had the wrong person, and that she was sorry if she had the wrong person, and that she hoped she had He right person. Marcus called her 45 minutes after she sent the email. He had seen the address, and he had seen the words, Harlan Creek, and he had not been able to wait. When Delia told him what she had found, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. She had been a teacher long enough to know the different kinds of silence. The silence of confusion, and the silence of calculation, and the silence of someone who has been struck somewhere tender, and she recognized this one. She waited. My brother rented a camera, Marcus said finally, for 1 day. July of 1987, I remember being filmed explaining about clouds. A pause. I was very serious about clouds. You were, Delia said. You were extremely serious about clouds. You were, Delia said. You were extremely serious about clouds. There was another silence, and then a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and was instead something that did not have a clean English word, but that Delia understood nonetheless. She mailed him the restored tape the next day. She included a note that said simply, "Your father was right." Marcus received the package on a Tuesday morning, and he did not open it immediately. He set it on his kitchen table and made coffee and sat with it for a while, the way his father used to sit with difficult things before addressing them. He had spent so many years looking for evidence that his family had existed in that house, on that land, in that community, and had found so little, and he was not quite ready, not in the first minute, to absorb what it might mean that someone had handed him 30 minutes of a Saturday afternoon. In July 1987, he called Patricia first. She was 73 and retired and living in Decatur, and when he explained what he had received, she was quiet in the way that she was never usually quiet, because Patricia had not inherited their father's relationship but silence, and her quiet now told Marcus everything he needed to know about how she was receiving this. "Play it," she said. "On video. I want to see it when you play it." He set up the video call. He pressed play. And Patricia watched from her living room in Decatur, and James watched from his house. Having been called by Patricia, and Leon watched from his kitchen with his wife sitting beside him, and they watched their mother scramble eggs and do a cooking show impression, and their father sit with his newspaper, and their younger selves run and argue and laugh and get hit by water balloons. And when it got to the moment on the porch, the golden light and the fireflies and the guitar, and Marcus eating a peach, Ruth's voice came through, restored, clear, a voice they had not heard in a decade, saying, "Samuel, say something for the camera." And Samuel looked up and said, "We are here. We have always been here." And they were all in their separate rooms, in their separate states, completely undone. Marcus took the tape to a historian at Vanderbilt University named Dr. Josephina Chabi, and Chabi, who specialized in Southern land history and who had spent years documenting the patterns by which black families were displaced from property during the mid to late 20th century through mechanisms that were technically legal and functionally identical in their outcome to the more explicit dispossessions of earlier eras. Dr. Achaby looked at the tape and at the legal documents Marcus had kept in the house folder and at everything Delia had found, and she made several calls, and within 2 weeks she had identified the connection between Robert, who had been Cora's husband, and a man named Ed Watkins, who had worked for the Harlan Creek Development Authority in the 1980s and who had apparently given the tape to Cora, his sister, for reasons that Cora never explained, and that Robert apparently never knew either. Having found the tape among Cora's things after her death, wrapped in a grocery bag, and kept it without knowing what to do with it, and eventually put it in the box, labeled junk, Ed Watkins had died in 2003, but he had kept the tape, and the tape had kept the family. Dr. Achaby wrote a paper. The paper was picked up by a journalist who wrote an article. The article was published and circulated widely, and a Georgia state representative read it, and a Georgia state representative read it and introduced a bill. And the bill did not pass because bills about acknowledging historical wrongs rarely pass easily, but it started a conversation that continued. And the county of Harlan Creek eventually issued a formal statement acknowledging that the condemnation proceedings against the Beaumont property had been improperly initiated, and that the family was owed an apology. The statement did not include the word reparation and did not include any financial component and was, by the measure of what had actually been taken, inadequate. But Marcus read it, sitting at the same kitchen table where he had opened the package, and he thought about his father sitting in his chair on the porch on a July evening, surrounded by his family, looking up at the camera and saying what he said. "We are here, D. We have always been here." The statement was inadequate, and the apology was late, and the house was gone, and Samuel and Ruth were both gone, and none of that was going to change. But the tape existed. The record existed. The Saturday afternoon in July 1987, existed, clear and restored and available, and anyone who wanted to know that the Beaumont family had lived on that land and loved each other and been present in the world in all the ordinary ways that constitute a life. Anyone who wanted to know that could now know it. Could now know it. Marcus called Delia to tell her about the statement, and Delia said that she was glad, and Marcus said that he had been thinking about something she had written in her note, the thing about his father being right, and he said he wanted to ask her about it, about what she meant. Delia thought for a moment. She was not, by temperament, a person who believed in signs, but she had learned over the 18 months of this strange experience that there were some things that did not fit neatly into the framework of the empirically demonstrative, and this was one of them. He said, "We are here," she said finally. And he was right. He is still here. All of them are still here, because of 30 minutes of a Saturday afternoon that someone kept in a box labeled junk. A pause. History is full of boxes labeled junk. A pause. History is full of boxes labeled junk. That's all I meant. Marcus was quiet. Then my mother used to say that you keep going. That's what matters. She was right too, Delia said. Yeah, Marcus said. She usually was. The thing about erasure, the thing that the people who practice it always fail to account for, is that it is never quite complete. You can destroy documents and demolish buildings and reroute the official story so that certain names don't appear in it. And you can do all of this with great thoroughness and great confidence that you have finished the job. But memory is not a filing cabinet. It does not stay where you put it. It travels in the ways that all living things travel, improbably and indirectly, inside a person who tells a story to another person, inside a tape at the bottom of a box, inside a child who grows up to be a meteorologist and who still, when he watches a cumulus cloud forming in the summer sky over Tennessee, thinks of a July afternoon in Georgia when he was 9 years old and the whole world was contained in a house at the end of a dirt road, and everyone he loved was there. They tried to erase this family. They did not succeed. One tape survived, and the tape was enough because the tape held a man looking into a camera on a summer evening and saying simply and with total certainty, the truest thing, we are here. We have always been here, and so they are.